Alright, y'all ready for round two? This is part two, Passover Expert, none you biz. Explains it all. So I showed you in just a real quick recap of episode one, part one, whatever. Part one, the importance of knowing what the heck you're talking about if you're talking about Passover. Feast of Unleavened Bread, when they kill the sacrifice, the spring Moedim. First was the counting of the Omer, etc. The dangers if you think like us good Catholics did. If you think Passover equals the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you're mistaken. If you think the Feast of Passover Passover is not a feast. Passover, Nehemiah Gordon will be the first to tell you, Passover means literally the sacrifice. The sacrifice. The sacrifice on the 14th of the month of the Aviv is when you sacrifice your lamb that you chose on the 10th and you kept up. Well, like I showed you in part one with these these are the chapters and verses we're going to go over. These are the exact same that we used in part one. We used these scriptures to prove that the Last Supper was a Passover Seder, and the Passover Seders are done away with, and we don't do them anymore, and we say a Mass every day in remembrance of Jesus. We mimic that Last Supper in Catholicism through the course of the Mass, turning the body and blood into wine and flesh, whatever, you know what I mean. Consubstantiation, transubstantiation, and the transconsubstantiation. Good gracious people, so as a Catholic, Passover, it's something the Jews did. We now grab the ball that they dropped. God's with us, and we don't do Passover anymore as a one-day event on the 14th of the month of the Aviv. You have to know when the month of the Aviv is. It's the new year. Make sure there's not a 12th month. You got to see the first sliver of the renewed moon, and you have to have the barley in a state of Aviv, so that in 14, 15, in a couple of weeks from now, you're going to have to grab a sheaf of it and wave it and give it to the priest, and the priest will wave it in 4 cardinal directions. So wave a big sheaf with it, and then you can immediately go to harvest your barley. It's barley. It's a poor man's wheat. You make beer out of it. All your beer makers are sitting there waiting. Hey, is the barley Aviv? Is the barley not Aviv? You know, we don't. You know, it's very important to them. It's especially the poor man who's like, hey, when can I eat? You have to know. But if you think that the 14th of the Aviv, your KJV says Aviv, A-B-I-B, it's actually A-V-I-V, like Tel Aviv, Israel. It's Aviv, the Aviv, actually. All the other months are numbered. It's the only month that is named. It's called the Aviv. We all know Passover for the Jews was on Aviv 14, Feast of Unleavened Bread. That one's not going to stay. 14th of the Aviv. The Aviv. You don't need to read it. The 14th of the Aviv. This is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Us Catholics learn. Or we assume. We simply read the New Testament. Those exact chapters and verses I gave you Because by a simple reading of that, you know that the Feast of Unleavened, you know erroneously that the Feast of Unleavened Bread equals Passover. No, it does not equal Passover. Passover is the 14th. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is for a week after. The first day is the high Sabbath. The last day is the high Sabbath. Sometime in between on those 7 days, there's going to be a weekly Sabbath. It continues on and on. There's going to be a weekly Sabbath. And wherever that weekly Sabbath falls, the following morning, Sunday morning, you're going to be giving your first fruits to the Lord. In this case, it's specifically going to be just the first sheaf of your barley, maybe the first paycheck or so, I don't know, your first tax return. But whatever it is, you're just going to wave it give it to the priest. He's going to wave it in 4 cardinal directions. But on this day of sacrifice here, it actually starts on the 10th, way back on the 10th. But if you think the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover is the 14th, you're highly mistaken. You're going to end up doing exactly as the Roman Catholic Church did, and you're going to start cannibalizing a 2,000-year-old corpse. Okay, we don't need that. You need to simply read some Old Testament and figure out what the heck these people are talking about. But Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that first spring Moedim, it's all on the 14th, right? It's all on the 14th. Snoopy, what the hell, brother? That's the mistake. That's the synopsis of chapter. That's of the part 1 that we did, showing what you're going to end up doing if you think that it's a 1-day-a-year event to celebrate Passover. The cedar, the unleavened bread you eat with it, the bitter herbs, the children asking their questions, all the different places on the plate. That's a 1 day. If you think that that's a 1-day-a-year event, you're mistaken. Number 1, you got to choose your lamb on the 10th, and number 2, you're eating it during what's the start of a high Sabbath. So are you going to go to Israel and celebrate Passover on the 14th and leave on the 15th? No, it's a high Sabbath. I wouldn't be doing anything like that. Let me erase this and we'll check in. Okay, here's what we know from a simple reading of the Pentateuch. You choose your lamb, unblemished, male, of the first year, weaned. Yes, weaned. 3 times it tells us in Torah. It tells us, "Thou shalt not roast a kid in its mother's milk." Figure it out. On the 10th, you choose this weaned, unblemished male lamb of the first year. That's up to 1 year old in America. Of the first year, that's 0 to 1, essentially. You choose your lamb on the 10th. You kill it on the 14th. You keep it up, literally. Whether that means in a stable, whether it means in your own home, which they probably did on the very first Passover, kept it in their home. Your kids are going to befriend this thing, and 3-4 days later, you're going to have to sacrifice it. And they sound just like children crying, don't they? Yeah, and then we keep it up. You ain't never going to forget that. You got something to say about my cigarettes making out the number 14? You ain't never going to forget that the Roman Catholic Church believes that 14th is 1-day-a-year event that you no longer do as a Jew. You come to find out, you choose your lamb, unblemished male of the first year, on the 10th. You keep it up. You kill it on the 14th. Immediately following that's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Yay! 15th through the 21st. The first day and the last day are a high Sabbath. And somewhere in between that, there's going to be a weekly Sabbath, because this is 7 days long. There's going to be a weekly Sabbath in there. It's very important, because no matter where it falls, if it falls on that day, the next day is your first fruit offering, barley sheaf wave offering. If the weekly Sabbath is the 19th, the next day is going to be your barley sheaf wave offering. One of those days, we don't know which one. You take your Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and you slide it over and you figure out what it is. This is the month of the Aviv still. We're still in the month of the Aviv. You want to think April, like spring, it's kind of like that. But we go off the lunar calendar. So you can, whatever these dates are all from based on the lunar calendar, and you can simply transpose it into your Gregorian calendar, your modern day calendar. You find out what the 14th is. Let's say it's the 10th of April. That just means that's the 9th of April. Okay, but don't forget, we start at sunset. We start our days. Your Feast of Unleavened Bread, Foob, your Feast of Unleavened Bread starts at sunset of the 14th of the Aviv. You're eating the lamb that you have roasted whole. You roast this male unblemished male lamb of the first year weaned, taken from the sheep or the goats, is to be roasted whole. After you slit its throat, you don't need a priest for this. You don't need a temple for this. You yourself, there's no priest or temple in Egypt. The blood you put on the doorpost, you wouldn't put any blood on the threshold, because you don't want to trample on the blood. You put it on the two sides and the top. That represented that there'd already been a sacrifice at that house, and the destroyer was going to pass by that house. Passover, it's going to Passover. That's where you get like the English, so to speak. It only works in English. Passover doesn't mean that death passed over us that day. Passover means literally the sacrifice. Yeah, the sacrifice. So we're still on the 14th. You can transpose this into your Gregorian calendar, figure out what it is. But once you memorize this for your Hebrew calendar, then it's easy peasy. You can read it in your New Testament and understand what the heck they're talking about. You don't have to jump to conclusions. Where are we at here? Matthew 26:2. 2 days before the Feast of Passover. Okay, number one, Passover is not a feast; it's a sacrifice. The feast that's commanded to be done forever is in Exodus, probably Leviticus, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, maybe they're talking about this whole thing, okay? But it specifically says Passover is a memorial, and that the blood that you put on the doorposts was a token. That was a one-time deal. You only do the blood on the doorposts that one time in Egypt. I think they only did it 2 more times out while they're out in the wilderness. And then after 38 years, they did it again, after coming over to Jordan. Not for sure on that, but certainly it's in 11 days. Who can count? It's an 11-day long event. It's an 11-day. It's not just a one time, once a year, whatever. Your weekly Sabbath, your Feast of Unleavened Bread, you choose your lamb, you keep it on the 10th, you keep it up.